When the producer said, "We're done here, pack it up," for the fourth time, Dean stood up from the corner and said, "I want to try something," so quietly that even Jerry Lewis didn't quite hear it. If he had, maybe he could have stopped him. Maybe they could have ended that night as just another ordinary failure. Wait, because the 3 minutes after Dean walked to that microphone would show how a man who'd been laughing quietly in Jerry's shadow for 3 months could change everything in one night, and almost nobody realized what it cost him. March 17th, 1953. Sunset Recording Studio, Los Angeles. The clock read 7:43 p.m., and the air inside the small booth had grown thick with cigarette smoke and frustration. Dean Martin sat in the corner chair, hands resting on his knees, watching the producer pace back and forth like a caged animal. For the fourth time that evening, the lead vocalist had tried to nail the final bridge, and for the fourth time, his voice had cracked on the high note. The producer stopped pacing and looked at the man in the vocal booth. "Tommy, your throat's shot. We need to call it." He glanced at his watch. 8:17. The studio was booked for another session at 9. If they couldn't finish tonight, they'd lose the slot for weeks. Dean's fingers tightened against his knees. He'd been sitting in that same spot for 6 hours, watching takes that never made it to the end. But something else had been happening during those 6 hours. While everyone focused on Tommy's failing voice, Dean had been learning the song, not just the melody he was supposed to hum along with during comedy sketches, but every lyric, every harmony, every breath between the notes. He knew he could sing it. The certainty sat in his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. "Pack it up, everybody," the producer announced to the room. "We'll try again tomorrow." The session musicians began unpacking their instruments. Jerry Lewis gathered his comedy scripts with visible annoyance. The pianist closed the lid with more force than necessary. Another night, another incomplete recording. In the competitive world of 1953 Hollywood entertainment, incomplete recordings meant lost opportunities, and lost opportunities meant other studios would fill the void. But Dean didn't move from his chair. He sat there staring at the empty microphone in the vocal booth, that weight in his chest growing heavier. 3 months earlier, Jerry Lewis had walked him through these same doors with a simple introduction. "This is Dean. He's the straight man. He'll handle the setups, I'll handle the punchlines." That was it. No mention of the songs Dean had sung in small clubs before the partnership. No mention of the vocal range he developed singing in church choirs as a kid. No mention of the nights Dean had stayed up until dawn perfecting harmonies that would never see the light of day. Jerry had his reasons for the omission. At the nightclubs where they'd started, Dean had been eager to contribute musical ideas, too quick to suggest arrangement changes. But there was something else Jerry hadn't mentioned to the producer, something about the real reason Dean stopped singing in those early clubs. That part would only make sense later. Dean had accepted the reduction in status because he needed the work. The transition from unknown club performer to Jerry Lewis's partner meant steady pay, even if it meant sitting in the background while Jerry became a star. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself he was learning the business from the inside. But those 3 months had been harder than he'd expected. Every morning he'd walked into that studio, knowing he had more to offer than anyone realized. Every evening he'd walked out having contributed nothing but straight lines and reliable timing. The worst part wasn't the invisibility itself. It was watching other singers struggle with songs he knew he could handle better. He'd seen promising tracks ruined by performers who couldn't find the emotional center of the material. He'd watched producers grow frustrated with artists who had the technical skill but lacked the instinctive understanding. During breaks between sessions, while other performers went outside to smoke or grab coffee, Dean would stay in the corner, quietly working through vocal arrangements in his head. He'd imagine how he would phrase certain lines, where he would add breath, where he would push the emotion harder. But tonight was different from the other nights. Something had changed in Dean before he'd even walked into the studio. What that something was wouldn't become clear until much later. Look at what was really happening during those 3 months. Dean wasn't just sitting there being polite. He was studying every session like a man preparing for war. He memorized how the best producers shaped performances. He noted which singers connected emotionally and which ones just hit notes. He watched the studio politics, the way decisions got made, the invisible hierarchy that determined who got heard and who got ignored. But temporary had stretched into 3 months of watching, waiting, and keeping his mouth shut. 3 months of arriving early and staying late, observing how hits got crafted, how arrangements came together, how the magic happened in that cramped studio 2 blocks off Sunset Boulevard. 3 months of perfect timing, flawless comedy delivery, and complete invisibility as a musician. The other performers had started to see him as part of the furniture. Reliable Dean, quiet Dean, Jerry's guy, the partner who never complained, never missed a cue, never caused problems. They liked him precisely because he made their lives easier by demanding nothing for himself. But there was one thing none of them knew, not even Jerry, something about what Dean had done just before the partnership began, a decision he'd made that he'd never spoken about to anyone in that studio. "You coming, Dean?" Jerry called from the doorway, scripts tucked under his arm. "Yeah, just give me a minute." Jerry shrugged and left. One by one, the others filed out until only Dean and the producer remained in the studio. The producer was shuffling through papers at the control board, muttering about tomorrow's schedule. He seemed to have forgotten Dean was still there. Dean stood up from his chair. His legs felt unsteady, not from fatigue, but from the realization that this moment had been building for 3 months. Every night he'd gone home to his small apartment and replayed the day's sessions in his mind. Every morning he'd woken up with melodies in his head that he never shared. Every week that passed, the weight in his chest had grown heavier. "I want to try something." The producer looked up from his papers, surprised. "Oh, Dean, thought you left already. What do you want to try?" Dean nodded toward the vocal booth. "The song, I want to try singing it." The silence that followed lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like an hour to Dean. He watched the producer's face process the request, saw the automatic no forming, then saw it pause as the man really looked at him for perhaps the first time since they'd been introduced. "You sing?" the producer asked. "I used to, before Jerry." Jerry never mentioned that. Jerry had other priorities. The producer glanced at his watch again. 8:24. 36 minutes until the next session. He leaned back in his chair, studying Dean with the calculating gaze that had built careers and crushed dreams in equal measure. Everything about this man's success had come from recognizing talent before anyone else did. He'd heard something in unknown performers that other producers missed. He'd seen potential in struggling acts when they were still playing dive bars. But he'd also learned to be suspicious of comedy sidekicks who harbored star ambitions. In 3 months, the producer had formed a clear impression of Dean Martin: reliable, professional, unambitious, the kind of performer who made everyone else's job easier by never complicating the process. He respected that quality, even if he didn't find it particularly interesting. But something in Dean's voice tonight was different. "All right," the producer said finally, "but just once. I don't have time to stroke egos tonight." Dean walked to the vocal booth on unsteady legs. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted the microphone stand. Through the glass, he could see the producer settling back into his chair with the weary expression of a man humoring a child. This was it, the moment that would either validate 3 months of silent observation or confirm his place as background support for Jerry Lewis's comedy career. He put on the headphones and heard his own breathing, amplified and suddenly too loud. The instrumental track began, and for the first 4 bars, Dean just listened, feeling the familiar rhythm he'd heard dozens of times that evening. Then he opened his mouth and began to sing. The first verse came out tentatively, almost conversational. He was feeling his way into the song, testing his voice against the arrangement, making sure everything fit. Through the glass, he could see the producer's expression hadn't changed, still waiting to be impressed, still skeptical. But something was happening inside Dean's chest. The weight that had been sitting there for 3 months was shifting, transforming into something else. Every word he sang felt like a small confession. Every note, a piece of himself he'd been hiding. The melody felt like something he'd been carrying his whole life, waiting for the right moment to release it. As he sang, memories flooded through him. His father's disapproval of his musical ambitions, the years of singing in small clubs, feeling the power of his voice, but never being allowed to use it fully. The nights before the partnership, when he'd performed in empty rooms, waiting for someone to notice. When the chorus arrived, his voice opened up completely, not the polished professional sound of the established studio singers, but something rawer, more vulnerable. There was pain in it, yes, but also hope. There was longing, but also determination. Each word carried the weight of 3 months of silence. The producer straightened in his chair. Through the glass, Dean could see the change in his posture, the way he leaned forward slightly, how his hand moved unconsciously toward the recording controls. But Dean couldn't stop now, couldn't let himself be distracted by the producer's reaction. The second verse found Dean settling deeper into the song, his voice gaining confidence with each line. He began to add small embellishments, tiny variations that made the familiar melody feel completely fresh. His left hand moved unconsciously, conducting an invisible orchestra, while his right hand gripped the microphone stand. He thought about Tommy struggling with this same song just hours earlier. Tommy's voice had been technically superior, more trained, more polished, but he hadn't been able to find the heart of the song. Dean found that place instinctively, not through technique, but through recognition. Notice what happened next, because this is where the transformation became visible. The quiet comedy partner disappeared entirely, replaced by someone the producer had never seen before. Dean's voice soared into a register that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his physical body, then dropped back down to a rich warmth that wrapped around the lyrics like velvet. And remember, this wasn't just about hitting notes. What Dean was doing in that moment was answering a question he'd been carrying for 3 months, a question nobody had thought to ask him until tonight. By the time the bridge arrived, the one that had broken Tommy 4 times, Dean was so deep inside the song that he forgot where he was. He forgot about Jerry, forgot about 3 months of invisibility, forgot about every doubt that had kept him silent. There was only the music and the truth it carried. When the song ended, the studio fell silent, except for the soft hiss of the recording equipment. Dean kept his eyes closed for a moment, not wanting to see disappointment in the producer's face, not ready to return to reality. What Dean didn't know was that Jerry Lewis had never made it to his car. He'd gotten halfway down the hallway when he heard something through the studio door, a voice he recognized but had never really heard before. Jerry had stopped walking, turned around, and stood outside that door for the entire final verse and bridge. Now he stood frozen in the corridor, hands still on the door handle, trying to process what he'd just heard. "Jesus Christ," the producer whispered. Dean opened his eyes. Through the glass, he could see the man staring at him with an expression he'd never seen before. Not the polite interest shown to hopeful artists, not the calculated assessment given to potential signings. Something closer to shock. "Where the hell did that come from?" the producer asked through the talkback system. Dean removed his headphones with shaking hands. "It's been there the whole time." The producer stood up and walked into the vocal booth, moving like a man in a daze. He stood directly in front of Dean, studying his face as if seeing it for the first time. "Jerry told me you were his comedy partner, the setup guy. Jerry saw what he needed to see, and you've been sitting in that corner for 3 months saying nothing." Dean nodded. "I was learning, watching, waiting for the right moment. And tonight was the right moment." Tonight I couldn't wait anymore. The producer was quiet for a long time, his mind clearly racing through possibilities. In the world of early 1950s entertainment, discovering a new talent wasn't just about finding a good voice. It was about finding someone who could carry the emotional weight of the music, who could make people believe in the stories being told. What the producer had just heard wasn't technically perfect. Dean's voice still needed training, still needed the polish that would come with experience, but the essential ingredient was there: the ability to transform pain into beauty, to make vulnerability sound like strength. "Can you do it again?" the producer asked. The clock on the wall read 8:47. 13 minutes until the next session arrived, but the producer didn't seem to care anymore. This time, when Dean sang, they recorded it. The tape that was made that night would become the foundation for Dean Martin's first serious consideration as a solo artist. The producer spent the next week playing the recording for other executives, for music directors, for anyone whose opinion mattered. Each person who heard it had the same reaction: shock, followed by recognition, followed by the question of how they'd missed this talent for 3 months. Stop for a second and picture what happened in the weeks that followed, because this is where the real story begins. Dean didn't immediately become a solo star. The recording didn't magically erase 3 months of being Jerry's sidekick. What it did was create a crack in the wall, a possibility that hadn't existed before. And here's what nobody in that studio knew that night. The decision Dean had made before joining Jerry, the one he'd never spoken about. He'd been offered a solo recording contract 6 months before the partnership began. A small label, nothing glamorous, but it was a real offer. He'd turned it down to work with Jerry because he thought the comedy partnership would be temporary, a stepping stone to something bigger. That choice had haunted him every single day of those 3 months. But now, finally, it made sense. He'd learned things during those 3 months that the solo contract could never have taught him. Jerry Lewis had mixed feelings about the recording. Part of him was genuinely happy for his partner. Part of him felt threatened, as if Dean had been playing a game he didn't know existed. Their comedy partnership continued, but something had shifted. The dynamic had changed in ways that wouldn't become fully apparent for months. The other performers in the studio had similar reactions. Some were supportive, others felt envious, as if Dean had somehow cheated by hiding his ability. A few simply didn't believe the recording was real, convinced there must have been some technical trick involved. But the recording existed, and it couldn't be unheard. The next session had arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, and they'd found the studio still occupied. The producer refusing to leave until Dean's second take was safely on tape. Within 6 months, Dean would begin taking solo singing engagements outside of the comedy partnership. Within a year, he would be fielding offers for solo recording contracts. Within 2 years, the Martin and Lewis partnership would begin showing the strain that would eventually break it apart. And about why tonight was different, why Dean had finally stepped forward after 3 months of silence. That morning, he'd received a letter from his father. Not a supportive letter, a cutting one, asking when Dean was going to stop embarrassing the family with this comedy nonsense and get a real job. Dean had read that letter in the studio parking lot before walking in, and something inside him had broken, or maybe something had finally been set free. Listen to this carefully, because it's the part that never makes it into the highlight reels. Success, when it came, felt different than Dean had imagined during those 3 months of sitting in the corner. The recognition he'd craved turned out to carry its own weight, its own complications. The spotlight that had seemed so appealing from the sidekick position became a pressure he wasn't fully prepared for. More troubling was the way success changed his relationship with music itself. During those months as Jerry's partner, music had been pure desire, the thing he wanted most but couldn't have. Once he had it, the simplicity of that desire became complicated by expectations, by business considerations, by the demands of an industry that wanted to package and sell what had once been private. The partnership with Jerry Lewis officially ended in 1956, 3 years after that recording session. By then, Dean had released multiple solo albums. He was headlining his own shows. The invisible sidekick had become one of the most recognized voices in American entertainment. But something else had ended that night, in 1953, something harder to quantify. The clarity of wanting had been replaced by the complexity of having. The man who had sat in the corner, burning with the desire to be heard, had achieved that goal completely. But achieving it meant discovering that being heard was only the beginning of a much longer, more complex journey. And here's the part that finally answers why Jerry never mentioned Dean's singing ability to the producer. The real reason behind those 3 months of silence. Jerry had heard Dean sing in those early nightclub days. He'd seen the audience's reaction, and Jerry, in his own way, had been protecting Dean, keeping him hidden until Dean was ready to handle what came with being heard. Jerry knew that once Dean stepped into that spotlight, everything would change between them. He'd been right. Remember what really happened that night, because the mythology tends to simplify it. Dean didn't just grab a microphone and become a star. He made a choice that he couldn't take back, that changed not just his career, but his entire relationship with his own voice. Before that night, singing was something private, something he did for himself. After that night, it became public property, subject to critique and commercial demands. The quiet comedy partner who had stood up from his chair that March evening had wanted nothing more than the chance to sing, to be allowed to use the voice he'd been hiding for 3 months. He'd achieved that goal entirely, but achieving it meant discovering that permission came with obligations he hadn't anticipated. Sometimes, in his dressing room after concerts in later years, when the applause had faded and the crowds had gone home, Dean would remember the purity of that moment in the studio, the pure clarity of wanting something simple, just to be allowed to sing. Before the complications of fame and success, before the weight of expectations, before the realization that being heard meant never being able to disappear again. That night, in 1953, he had stepped forward and claimed his voice. Everything that followed, both the triumph of his solo career and the eventual dissolution of the partnership that had brought him to Hollywood, grew from that single moment of courage. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. The transformation was complete and utterly irreversible. The sidekick had become the star, but the cost of that transformation was a simplicity he would never recover. And if you want to hear what really happened the night Jerry Lewis walked back into that studio and heard the recording for the first time, tell me in the comments.